what I'm trying to demonstrate here is the goal is never to be at the mercy of the content, is to go for the process. In other words, what's unfolding inside your mind at these moments. Again, if you're identifying with this, when you start to become dysregulated, when you start to become overwhelmed with emotion. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Narcissism Decoder. I'm your host, Dr. Anthony Mazzella. Today's episode is going to be quite different. I was preparing for a class that I teach on personality disorders, and as I was reviewing some of the material, especially around borderline personality organization, I realized something. These concepts that I was reviewing actually illuminate so much of we've already been exploring about narcissism. So I want to take you into my thinking process today. This is something that I wanted to do for a long time. So instead of giving you a more polished, structured episode, that's what I typically release. Today, I want to do something a little more spontaneous. I'm going to bring you right into my thinking process. As I was reviewing for class, I want to let you know what stood out to me, what surprised me, and how I'm connecting these concepts in real time. And that's as I'm looking over my notes. I'm bringing you right into it. So the first thing that struck me was the same defenses that we talk about in narcissism, like splitting, idealization, devaluation, these show up in borderline personality disorder as well, but with a very different emotional logic. Let me just call it borderline. I want to be short with this so I don't have to keep saying borderline personality disorder. So I have to figure out how to say this. But just so you know, I'm not talking about a formal diagnosis. So let me just put that out there. It's much like I do with narcissism. I like to think about traits and dynamics and characteristics. Okay. So with these borderline characteristics, oftentimes they get confused with narcissism. And there's a lot of overlap, but they're not the same. There's our shared inability, or let me say instability in self-esteem. There is a search for connection, and the defenses are there in both of them against shame and humiliation. But the emotional tone, the attachment patterns, the way each person protects themselves, that's the defenses, there are slight differences. Now, I'm not going to get into all of that right now. This is something I'm going to unpack gradually over time as I let you into my way of thinking about and preparing for classes. But as I'm building up for the class and I share these upcoming episodes with you, you'll hear me circle back to BPD or borderline characteristics, right? And as I circle back to them, I'll contrast them. I'll compare and contrast them with narcissistic characteristics. And I will highlight the psychodynamic threads that connect and separate them. Now, it's not going to be a one-shot lecture. That's what I'm preparing you for as I'm saying this out loud, okay? This is going to be more like an ongoing conversation that develops as I refine my thinking about these traits and concepts around borderline traits and narcissistic traits and characteristics, okay? So I hope that makes sense to you. But I'll say, now that I put that out there, I want to at least introduce a few core borderline traits because they'll help frame what I've been looking at as I prep for class, and they'll help frame what I hope is this series of episodes. Borderline dynamics are, in many ways, another path that the psyche takes to protect itself from early emotional trauma, early emotional deprivation. But instead of retreating into grandiosity, and for those of you who have been listening along, you know I always say the main structure, the defining characteristic of someone who has or identifies with narcissism is the grandiose sense of self, which is a very complicated concept. Again, I won't go into that right now. But the point is the main structure is grandiosity. The borderline, while they may have grandiosity, of course there's overlap, but in the borderline mind, there's more of this clinging. And in the mind, the emotional sort of regulation, you'll see it, they're more prone to decompensation. So you see someone become more dysregulated and someone who craves connectedness and merger, but also simultaneously fearing it. So let me say that a different way, okay? While narcissistic patients retreat into self-sufficiency, which again is part of the grandiose structure, it's that dismissive quality, it's the withdrawing, it's the affective block, all the things again that I've been talking about. Those who suffer with borderline characteristics chase an impossible fantasy, someone who will finally give them the love, the soothing, and the perfect attunement that they never received. Now, as I was just saying that, it made me think. People in narcissistic relationships see these patterns all the time. You may even be saying, I recognize this, even if they're not named as borderline characteristics. So let me just walk you through how I'm thinking about these concepts and why all this matters. So when thinking about borderline characteristics, one thing that strikes me is that they often have trouble, and I say mother, but I'm thinking about more of the classical literature on this. But if you could say parental problems, but the main point is whether you think of a mother, a father, or caregiver, is they are still very much involved on an emotional level with trying to get the caregiver's love and approval. Okay? So now this may look like they're going home and they're so afraid of being, different from the family, right? Different from what they think that the parents want them or who they want them to be. And this leads right into another major characteristic when someone has these borderline tendencies, which is identity. So they can't just go home and do what they feel most comfortable doing, just being themselves, because they struggle with identity. In object relation school, they call that identity diffusion, which again is another complicated concept that we'll break down over time. But the main point is in their identity, they have a really hard time integrating contradictory views of themselves and of others because of splitting, which is again another major characteristic when thinking about these borderline traits. So you see intense splitting, and this leads to this feeling, it leads to many things, but one is in relationships that there's this intense craving, this neediness that I just mentioned, this fear of abandonment, right? So when there are fears of abandonment and that's in the foreground, they may cling and make excessive demands for love or support, right? That you should be there for them exactly the way that they think you should be there. But again, there's a problem because of the splitting at the same time. They're also completely concerned that they're going to get engulfed, right? That they're going to lose their sense because they don't have that identity that I mentioned a moment ago. So if they become engulfed in closeness, if there's too much closeness, too much togetherness, that they fear, right, that they're going to be taken over and they're going to lose their own sense of identity. And then finally, I'll just name one more, but there's an enormous amount of rage and maybe even a history of temper tantrums. Now, the reason that this exists is complicated, and again, we'll get into this more as we go along, but those were some of the main things I wanted to point out. So the goal here was just to draw in your attention to some of these key defining characteristics and begin to show you that there is actually a little overlap. Like a moment ago, I just mentioned that there's a craving, right? That there's a neediness, an intense neediness, and a fear of abandonment. But again, you see this with narcissistic patients as well. This is something that I've written about, or I should say I discussed on this podcast quite frequently, called the craving narcissist, or what we can also call like the vulnerable narcissist. I have a few episodes on that, distinguishing it, by the way, from the covert narcissist. But anyway, so there's a longing to be close and to be held, skin-to-skin contact. And then there's a fear that when they merge with the other, that their identity is going to be taken over. They're going to lose their sense of what we call in my field ego boundaries, but basically lose their sense of self. Here's another defining characteristic that you may not hear as much about in social media. It's difficult for them to reflect upon and to generate an understanding of their own subjective experiences. So this means that rather than reflecting and thinking, that they are more prone to action. So there's more action than reflection. And this is different, by the way, in terms of what you see with those who have these narcissistic characteristics, right? Because these are people who can get very much involved and they're not as prone to action. These are people who can have a very successful career, where somebody's struggling with more of these borderline characteristics. It's more common, not always, but they may have a harder time, for instance, holding down a job. Why? Because of this mode of what we call like this literal mode of interacting. Now, the literal mode of interaction means that people who function in this literal mode tend to take on like a more venting approach to things. So in other words, if something goes wrong at work, right, they could take on a ventilative approach, which means that they're going to dump or purge everything inside of them, which could be a lot of anger or frustration or disappointment. But the main point is that these feelings will come out, that there's less of a filter for them. And then, of course, less reflection. So what happens when you're with somebody like this, it's really hard to get some movement. So if you're thinking about this in terms of somebody in your life, right, and they come to you with some problem that they had at work, you have to keep in mind that stories are told not with a quest to deepen the relationship or their understanding of what went wrong, but they want to convey something that's immediate and that's emotionally painful, and probably just seek validation in terms of how much they were suffering at work. And now this is understandable because you have to think back. Most likely a lot of their early childhood was invalidating. But again, a story for another day. Let me give a little example of this.
Let's take a quick break.
Are you tired of feeling like you're walking on eggshells all the time? Do you feel drained, confused, or like nothing you do is ever good enough? Are you stuck in a cycle of elation, then criticism and confusion? If any of this sounds familiar, you're not alone. And that's exactly why I created Office Hours with Dr. Anthony Mazzella. That's me. Office Hours is a low-cost, small group space where you could bring your questions about narcissistic traits and dynamics and the places where you feel stuck. You'll be met with honest, grounded feedback. I'll hold the group with structure, but there's also space for real conversation. This is a space designed for anyone looking for clarity, insight, and support. If that sounds like you, just click the link in the show notes to join us. Okay, I hope to see you there. A prototypical patient arrives to session, right, and says that she had thoughts, and here you could fill in the blank, but she had thoughts of cutting herself or punching herself or inflicting some sort of harm, maybe over drinking, or a fellow comes in talking about having the thoughts to seek out prostitute, right, a married man. Now, you see, the approach is very similar to something that you've heard me talk about quite a bit. They come in very upset. They're talking about a self-destructive behavior, and they're not necessarily looking to understand why this is. But when we start to slow them down, this is again the initial act of containment. What I begin to hear is, and this is again a lot of overlap with these narcissistic characteristics, is that their wife retreated early to the bedroom, or they were at work and a friend, not just a colleague, but a friend at work, wasn't there when they wanted to tell them some good news about what happened over the weekend, and their friend colleague was on the phone. Immediately they start to think, like the fellow with his wife who retires to the bedroom early, a colleague at work is not there for you. You know, you go home and your mother is preoccupied with your brother or your sibling or a new pet that they got. But the immediate thought is, they don't care about me. And this begins to spiral quickly. And it could go in many different directions. Like, what's wrong with me? Why don't they care? And then it could be, what's wrong with her? Or what kind of best friend is this? Or what's wrong with my mother? And then it goes back and forth. And I really have no friends. Or no one in the family really cares about me. I'm so different from the rest of the family. So the first order of business when I encounter something like this in my own practice is the act of containment, slowing this stuff down. So you see already we move from I want to inflict harm on myself. I want to cut myself. To now we're getting at something, which is a very painful emotion, that if someone just looks in a different direction, if you ask for something and there's a moment of pause, the feeling is immediately that they don't care, right? And I could reflect on that with them, and I could really appreciate that they really wanted and hoped that this other person, again, you fill in the blank here, but that this other person would be there and would be thinking about them. So when they arrived home, maybe they would have prepared a meal for them after a long trip back home, right? Or the colleague would have hung up the phone, for instance. But the main point is, if, again, you have somebody like this in your life and you're thinking about, how do I relate to them? Or if you yourself spiral in this way very quickly, the main thing to keep in mind is it's not about the content. It's not about the main point of the story, which is, I'm just so angry and I want to lash out and I want to hurt myself or I want to hurt somebody. But you slow this stuff down and you can begin to see, and it becomes understandable, that you had expected, or that your friend or somebody who's talking to you expected so much more. And then someone only gave them very little compared to what they were expecting. And as you can imagine, that can be very upsetting. So what I'm trying to demonstrate here is the goal is never to be at the mercy of the content, is to go for the process. In other words, what's unfolding inside your mind at these moments. Again, if you're identifying with this, when you start to become dysregulated, when you start to become overwhelmed with emotion. So let me give one other quick example of this literal mode of functioning. Another case comes in, another patient, let's say hypothetical, because so many of this is very common. And they talk about how they blew up on somebody, their wife, the waitress, let's say. And again, the same thing. I want to slow down, and I want to see as I'm slowing this down if this resonates. And sometimes if I can get them to slow down, but they don't have that capacity, like I mentioned earlier, the symbolic capacity, that's the capacity to use language, to bring meaning to their affective states, their intensive affective explosions, right? So I may say something to them, or I may focus on how awful it must have felt when, I don't know, let's say this fellow went out to dinner and he blew up on the waitress, right? And then I start to understand that the waitress brought his food, but his burger was undercooked. He didn't order the burger this way. But I could begin to reflect the same thing that I just mentioned a moment ago. This is the initial act of containment. And depending on whether or not you can get into a more regulated state, use language to symbolically represent what's going on inside of you rather than action, rather than anger, rather than attacking. You begin to see that the feeling, the underlying feeling is oftentimes what? About here we are again, that someone didn't care enough to listen to you closely, to listen to what you ordered. Someone didn't care enough to think that you are traveling to go home to visit your parents, and that you may arrive hungry, or to prepare a meal for you, or that your wife, when she retired to the room early, didn't consider that maybe this would have an impact on you. So here you can begin to empathize with the fact that how awful this must have felt. And this is something I may or may not say, you see, because this could be a big leap. At the very least, we could get to the fact that they didn't listen to you. They did not think about you. But on a deeper level, it's what? That you feel so unimportant to her, to your parents, to your wife. And then if they go a step further, see, now this is very common, and they go on the attack, which is a wonderful but horrible solution. It's wonderful in the sense that it gets you away from dealing with the process, the emotions, but we could talk about that too, right? That the only way for you to feel better then was to humiliate your wife, or to humiliate the waiter, right? Or pick a fight with your parents and show your parents or anyone how inadequate they are. See, there's the overlap again, by the way, with these narcissistic traits, because there's a sense of superiority over feeling a sense of being what? Inferior, unimportant. So it's like a superiority complex to defend against an inferiority complex, but you don't know because of the action that when you go into the literal mode of functioning, where there's very little reflecting, right? And there's a lot of action, the focus tends to be on what, of course? on the action, the behavior, and not the underlying feelings. Okay, I want to begin to wrap this one up, but let me just say, again, if this is you and you're identifying with some of these characteristics, or somebody in your life who tends to be prone to these explosive-like behaviors, the question can become, what do we do? Like, how do we help somebody? How do we even develop a capacity for symbolization? Again, I'm using that word strictly just today in terms of using language instead of action. Remember I said they go into a ventilative mode. They sort of purge out the feelings rather than reflecting on them. So one way to think about this is to get them to a place where they can play. And what I mean by play is just open up a little bit of space. And that's what I was trying to demonstrate earlier with those clinical examples. But the main point is to take them from a literal mode to more of a representational mode of functioning, to open space so they can begin to do what? Reflect on an inner experience. One way to open up space, or let me say, in order to open up space, they need to trust you. So playing, developing more of a representational mode, developing more of a symbolic capacity, assumes that there is trust. How do you begin to develop trust? Well, one way is through the act of containment, what I mentioned earlier, reflecting back what you heard and empathizing with how difficult that must be. It's not agreeing with their behavior. You're not giving them permission, but you're appreciating the subjective experience that they felt unheard or that their parents didn't think about them. It's only very slowly over time, and this is where most people go wrong who are in these relationships, whereas many people want to go in and give suggestions and give advice. That comes much later. The first step, if you think about playing with a child, if I could use this metaphor, the first step is to watch the child play. It's not to go in and take over the child's experience. Then maybe you'll sit on the floor with the child. Eventually, maybe you will play along with the child, right? And then finally, this is the final step. I'm running through this quickly, but this is the way you begin to work, or I say work because I'm thinking therapeutically, but I could say relate to these people, is later you can introduce your own way of playing, right? And that's what most people do first. That's what I meant by giving advice or giving suggestions. That's your own way of playing. All right, so there you have it. Some free associations around distinguishing characteristics of, narcissistic and borderline characteristics and tendencies, a little bit about how they overlap, a little bit about how they're different. And again, the whole point of this kind of episode is to sort of bring you along in my thinking process. Again, not a polished episode like I typically present, but something different. Let me know what you think. If you like this, shoot me an email, send me a message. Let me know if you'd like to hear more of this. I'm going to do a brief series of inviting you to think along with me, clinically, relationally, if that's even a word, and we'll see where this goes. If this spoke to you and you're curious to learn more about all issues related to narcissism, please support the show by subscribing so you don't miss what's coming next. And even more importantly, take a moment to leave a review. Reviews make the podcast easier for others to find, which helps the show grow. The more the show grows, the more I can invest in creating thoughtful content that supports you in understanding and navigating your experiences with narcissism. Okay, thanks for being here with me. I'm grateful we got to explore this one together. Until next time, take care of yourself. Bye for now. Disclaimer alert. The Narcissism Decoder podcast is provided for general information purposes only. The content presented in this podcast is not intended to diagnose, treat, or cure any psychological condition related to narcissism. The content on this podcast should not be considered a substitute for professional medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment. For specific advice pertaining to narcissism or any other psychological condition, you could reach me directly. I am an experienced mental health practitioner who is always taking on new patients. If you would just like a consultation, I can do that too.